All right, today we're going to peel back the layers on a piece of hidden history. We're diving into a really provocative and, let's be honest, super controversial source text. It gives a completely different perspective on what is a truly foundational tragedy.
So let's start with a question, a really tough one that's been asked for centuries. How on earth did the Prophet Muhammad's own community end up killing his grandson, Hussein, at Karbala? I mean, think about that. It's a tragedy that sits at the very heart of this history. And believe me, the answer is anything but simple.
Okay, and before we go any further, I need to make something crystal clear. Our job here isn't to say this is what happened. Not at all. We are simply and neutrally looking at the chain of events and the accusations just as they are laid out in the specific source we're examining today. We're exploring its answer to that big question.
So, to really get a grip on the argument this source is making, it does something interesting. It starts at the end, right there, with the tragedy at Karbala. And from that point, it starts working its way backward, trying to trace the roots of what happened through generations of what it calls conflict and conspiracy.
Now, this text is very specific about who it blames for the immediate events. It points right to the top, to the Umayyad Caliph, Yazid. Then you've got the man on the ground, the commander, Umar ibn Saad. And then there's a guy named Shimr. And the source makes a point of noting that he had actually fought with Ali, Hussein's father, before turning against his family, a real twist of the knife.
The source really tries to get inside the head of one of these key players. It brings up this poem, which it attributes to Umar ibn Saad. In this poem, wow, it frames his choice not as some religious duty, but as a struggle between raw, worldly ambition and the fear of eternal damnation. And in this story, ambition won, hands down.
But here's the thing. According to this source, just pointing the finger at these guys is missing the point. It claims they were just the final bitter fruit on a tree that had been growing, rotting for decades. So if we want to find the real cause, well, we have to start digging.
And that digging leads us to what the source calls the cursed tree. That's its name for the Umayyad dynasty. And the text doesn't see them as just another political family that took power. No, it paints them as something fundamentally against the Prophet's message, right from the very beginning.
The source really lays out this lineage, this direct line of opposition. It starts way back with the clan's founder, then moves to Abu Sufyan, who was a major leader in Mecca and actively fought against the Prophet. Then comes his son, Muawiyah, the one who turned the caliphate into a hereditary monarchy. And who's at the end of that line? Yazid, the very caliph who ordered the killing of the Prophet's grandson.
So you see, the really crucial point the text is making here is that this was never just a political squabble over who gets to rule. It's alleging the entire Umayyad project was an ideological takeover, specifically designed to subvert Islam from the inside out and put power right back into the hands of the people who had been its biggest enemies.
Okay, so if the Umayyads are the branches and Karbala is the bitter fruit, what's the root? What or who does the source claim allowed this whole cursed tree to grow in the first place? Well, the answer it gives takes us all the way back to the very moment the Prophet died. And this is where we get to the most explosive claim in the entire text. It argues that the rot didn't start with the Umayyads. It claims it all began the second the Prophet passed away, with what it calls a foundational conspiracy.
The text even puts a name to it. It talks about a secret pact, something it calls the cursed document. And the allegation is staggering, that a group of the Prophet's own companions conspired, while he was still alive, to make sure the caliphate would not go to his chosen heir, Ali, that it would be seized by them instead. So you can see here, the source creates this incredibly stark contrast. On one side, you have Ali, painted as the one and only legitimate, divinely appointed successor. And on the other side, you have the first three caliphs, Abu Bakr, Umar, and Uthman. They're framed as, well, usurpers, who basically knocked Islam off its true path and set the stage for everything bad that was about to happen. And the specific accusations this text makes they're heavy. It claims they totally ignored the Prophet's declaration of succession at Ghadir Khoum. It alleges they physically attacked his own daughter, Fatima, that they started changing religious laws. And maybe most shockingly, it even claims they were involved in poisoning the Prophet himself, basically blaming them for his death. Now, to push its argument even further, the source goes into some deeply personal and, frankly, inflammatory attacks. It gets into questioning the ancestry and even the parentage of major figures like Umar. And from the text's point of view, these aren't just playground insults. This is a deliberate strategy to undermine their moral and religious right to rule. Right.
So a huge question pops up here, doesn't it? Even if you take these claims at face value, how could a conspiracy this massive actually work? How do you change the entire direction of a new faith? The source says the answer is all about who controls the story. It becomes a battle over information itself.
So now, let's look at how the source claims this happened. It argues that whoever won the political fight immediately went to work on controlling the religious narrative, making absolutely sure that their version of history, their version of the faith, became the only one people heard.
And to make its case, the text points to the collection of hadith, the sayings of the Prophet. It brings up the famous scholar al-Bukhari. He was working almost 200 years after the Prophet, and he reportedly had to sift through something like 600,000 narrations.
Okay, so he starts with 600,000. But out of that massive number, how many unique, non-repeated sayings actually made it into his famous collection, Sahih al-Bukhari? Just over 2,600. That is a huge drop. And the source we're looking at says, hey, pay attention to that difference.
So the source basically asks the question, was this massive filtering process just an example of incredible careful scholarship, separating the good from the bad, or was it something else? Was it, as the text alleges, a deliberate political process designed to weed out any stories that challenge the rulers or, happen to support the claims of the Prophet's family?
And the text claims this control over information started way earlier. It alleges that the second caliph, Umar, actually banned people from writing down the Prophet's sayings. But at the same time, it claims he was super interested in the Torah and would bring Jewish scriptures to the Prophet, who would apparently get really angry about it. The source presents this as a major contradiction. All right, let's pull all these threads together now. What we're seeing is that this source isn't just throwing out random accusations. It's weaving a complete alternative grand narrative of early Islamic history, a story where everything is connected.
So here's how the whole timeline of corruption breaks down, according to the source. Step 1. A secret pact is made while the Prophet is still alive to grab power. Step 2. The second he dies, the caliphate is usurped. Step 3. The Prophet's own family is pushed aside and attacked. Step 4. Religious knowledge itself is controlled, filtered, and altered. Step 5. This paves the way for the Umayyad dynasty to cement a worldly, corrupt rule. And Step 6. This whole chain reaction leads directly, inevitably, to the tragedy at Karbala. It wasn't an accident. It was the final domino to fall.
And that brings us to the end. Look, what we've done here is walk through one very controversial narrative from one specific source. It paints a picture of the past where the battle lines were drawn from day one and the conflict was total. It really leaves you with a big, provocative question, doesn't it? What happens when history itself isn't settled and done, but is still a live battlefield where the fight for what it all means is still happening right now?